Greetings and welcome to Lessons with Odin. This episode is part of my Basics series where I will be going over how to read patterns. I've had this request a few times, so I'm gonna go kind of really basic and fundamental on this video because everybody has different learning patterns, everybody's at different levels, so I'm gonna do a bit of a baseline instruction. And you might learn some new things, you might not learn anything, and since a lot of people here are self-taught, there might be a lot of holes in your knowledge that you might or may not think of. And you might actually learn some more resources because I can show you a little bit about where I get my things, especially online. So I'm going to go over various different types of patterns from Peyote stitch patterns to diagrams and such from books and magazines, and the most important places to look for resources. So I am going to begin with books that are at least published in the US, and tell you guys a little bit about the resources within a books. I have Bead-Weaving Beyond the Basics by Cassie Shaw. This is a really fantastic book. If you haven't got this in your library, it's a very, very awesome compendium. This is a really nice put together book. I have a full review on it somewhere in here and possibly in the links down below as well. So when it comes to the resources inside of a book, the first things you may or may not notice is the resources at the front of the book. All the intros, there's usually a guide that says how to use this book, and there are the basic stitches and materials, a common description of the materials. I know I personally skip immediately to the patterns and work backwards to figure out what I need and what I can do, but that's just me because I'm a very impatient person. But most books have these kinds of guides in the front of the piece, and it tells you a little bit more about bead shapes, and then commonly it comes with a stitch compendium as well. Usually a diagram with a small blurb of text that describes what's going on. And at least in this example, there's generally a start point and an end point, or that tells you the direction of the thread is going. So in this example, this one is showing you from your start, you're going to thread on 2 blues, 2 greens, and 2 purples, and you're going to go in this direction. Now it doesn't always look like this when you are threading it. Now a thing to keep in mind is when these diagrams are being illustrated, they're being illustrated in a 2-dimensional space, so you kind of have to work your brain around to figure out where things are going to go. Like especially with tubular herringbone is a good example. This is not what the pattern is going to look like when you pinch everything together. This is just a Y shape that kind of illustrates where the direction of the thread is going to go, but as you pull things tight, it's going to form the herringbone here. And it's kind of the similar vein that it makes it easier each step to get through a pattern because you can realize, okay, this is your start. So when we transition from the first step to the second step, we know that these beads already exist, and it shows here in the picture that the beads that are these are the same beads because they are lighter in a pattern. And as we move on to more complicated pieces, you can kind of develop that knowledge and build up from what you know and what you can see in this piece. Now, usually in a book with one separate pattern, there's going to be a little blurb about the design itself, inspiration, what have you, and you're going to have your materials and your key on the beginning, as well as some nice, beautiful pictures. Now, depending on the complexity of the pattern and the difficulty of the stitch, some patterns in books may or may not skip over details and not go over every graphic detail and assume that you have a certain amount of knowledge. Like, for example, you start the bezel by making a strip of DDRAW, which is the double diamond right angle weave, which is named based on the diamond shape that you're creating. But as you can see, we have the standard pathways. We start from a bead, we go around, move around and through and around, and it's really easy to follow the guidelines. Another important place to look at are the indexes in the back, because sometimes there will be not only the subject matter on the index in the back of the page, but also sometimes resources, as well as some quick charts and guides that can give you a better idea to kind of guesstimate how much you need of one thing. Like, for example, in this book, Crystal Jewelry with Swarovski by Laura McCabe, this one has a lot of handy resources and guides in the front, because this one has a guideline for bezels, and it has just a nice quick place to figure out the Rivoli size, how many rows in peyote, and depending on the size of the beads you use, it's just a nice quick reference when you don't feel like doing the math yourself. And she's even got references for the different shapes of rivolis. So that's just a real nice tip. But in the back of this book is sources of supply. This is generally where this person buys their beads and such. It's always good to just look at it for your own arsenal and to see what beads you like in your collection and if anybody has any. Because I found that bead supply shopping is very difficult. There's really no one-stop shop for anything, especially because everybody has very particular tastes. And I'll kind of illustrate with one of my patterns. This is pretty much the same thing, how I've tailored everything. I go through, when I'm designing a pattern, very, very detailed, step-by-step instructions. Because generally, I don't know the skill level of the person who orders this, even though I do say that, hey, this is a beginning stitch, this is an intermediate stitch, this is an advanced stitch. I still like to go through because everybody considers themselves different levels, or some people want to try out harder stitches, and I don't want them to be fighting with the pattern. So this is kind of what I do. I've got my supply lists here, and I start essentially the same thing. I have my dot that starts the direction, the order of the beads being put on, wrapped around in my thread direction, and I go through each phase. This is how I turn a thread in a super duo. This is how I add more beads, then I tell you to go all the way around, and each step by step. Which is why, it takes me forever to finish patterns. But even in my photographed patterns, I've started doing that now instead of the computer-generated ones. I take pictures of each and every single solitary step to kind of help you guys build up your knowledge and to kind of help gears click when it comes to looking at other patterns and looking for comparisons to each design. Now, I personally do not like American magazines. I find that their directions are incredibly abridged, which, while I can get through the pattern's fine, I have had multiple times students come up to being like, hey, I got this pattern from a magazine, can you tell me how to use it? Because I cannot figure out these instructions. And I know the patterns need to be abridged in order to fit as many patterns and designs as possible in there, but they cut a lot of things out and they make things really inaccessible, in my opinion. Obviously, the good benefits of this is they have ads, which show you a bunch of resources and kind of inspire you on the new shapes and stuff, which may or may not be a good thing because there are a lot of ads on these things, but generally in the back, there are also common bead stitches and techniques that are good to know, and when all else fails, Google is your friend when it comes to techniques and stitches that you just have absolutely no idea where they come from. And if you are Googling, be sure to add beading in the search bar, because if you just do things like herringbone stitch or peyote stitch or what have you, Google might not necessarily know that you're talking about beads. So just keep that in mind as well. It's generally pretty good for the basic stitches, such as something like the chenille stitch, or when you're learning just basic technique. But when it comes to like a little bit more unconventional designs, there's very few patterns, and it's very hard to just kind of put one picture to another step in text, and the text is just kind of written in a way that isn't very mingly. So my advice for these kind of patterns, if you're having problems with that, is to find the keyword techniques that they use and kind of Google them and see how it works and practice with another kind of project, or just kind of hammer through. Now, my absolute favorite source of patterns comes from Japanese books. I do not know Japanese. I know a little bit of katakana, which helps me with the supplies, but these, you don't need it. You just don't need to read them at all. These, I don't know if it's based on publisher or what have you, or if there's just like a standardized methodology for writing jewelry and beading books, but they're just really fantastic, really clear, and very visual. And every book that I've picked up, no matter if it's a book or a magazine, I've been able to interpret the directions no problem. So first off is the circle graphs, which are focusing on the right angle weave, and there are usually 2 or more threads involved when making these kind of three-dimensional figures. For example, this looks like an absolute mess if you're just looking at it at face value, but break it down and look at smaller designs first, because there are several rows here, and there's a lot of labels and a lot of information telling you where to go next. So first off, we generally have the key of the supplies, and this was really easy for me to figure out because since there are item numbers on here, I know these are Swarovski. So we can see we've got 5301, 5301, these are probably bicones, 55,000, this is a round. This tells you the colors, and they're written in katakana, so it's very easy to kind of, if you want to go that far, learn a little bit of the katakana to figure out what the colors are, because they're basically sounds. So if you figure out what the sound is, you can kind of say it out loud a few times and decipher what the color is. And then this symbol on the side means number or unit, so this tells you how many you will need for your pattern. And then this one has the picture to tell you what goes to what. This one is here, so this tells you what additional you might need. So now let's look at the diagram itself. We have two different threads, a blue and a red. And number 58 is where we're going to end up. So right in the very center is number 1. And we can see that we only have one thread at the start. So you're going to thread on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then because we're using two threads, we're going to cross at this very last bead, which would be a circle, probably a round, a jet black round. Then you take your colors and you determine what thread you add and what thread you cross. So it looks like we're going to go through, we're going to add 4 beads with one thread, then we'll cross with the other thread. And we'll keep going in that pattern. We'll add these beads here. And before, it looks like we're going to set up the red thread by passing through a bead on this very first circle. And we continue around, adding beads, passing through a previous circle until we go all the way around. When we get to the final circle, you can kind of figure out where that is because of the numbers, and because this is at a cross, we'll pass through a bead from the previous round, add more with the opposite thread, cross, and keep going around in a circle until we reach the last row at the end here. Then we're going to do the same thing, it's just since this circle is so wide, the beads are so wide apart, but that's not what's going to happen when you pull everything tight. Again, this is one of those things where you're trying to make a 3-dimensional shape printed forward on a 2-dimensional scene. So essentially we have 1, 2, 3, 4 rows to make the head of this creature. Another good thing to note is that generally the numbers that are here also indicate the numbers that are over here. So number 22 on this chart is the same exact thing as number 22 on this chart. So as you add more beads and work more beads, they're each going to be numbered, so you know exactly where you're supposed to be at any given point. And as you can tell, these can get kind of nuts. This one has numbers up to 238, as far as I can see, 249, 250 over there. But start off with small patterns and break them down each number by number. You can get there, just kind of slowly get there one at a time. Use some sort of pen or marking device, take a photocopy of your book, and mark it down with like a pen and some X's so you can find your place wherever you have gone. But even in a lot of Japanese books that aren't circle graphs, it's very easy to find your way, and you really don't need to speak Japanese in order to be able to make the patterns. They're just really nice and concise and very easy to pick up using those same rules. Another thing to note is generally the star on, you might see some diagrams that have a star on them. This means where you start your thread. So the last types of patterns I want to talk about are the peyote and the flat tapestry kinds of patterns. These ones have a little bit of fun times to read. And one of my favorite resources for peyote patterns is this place called KandiPatterns.com. Kandi kind of refers to the candy ravers back from the early 2000s who wore really, really bright things and is fascinated with a lot of cutesy culture and stuff. But a lot of their designs, they use pony beads, but they use either the peyote stitch or even the straight stitch, as well as perler beads. on CandyPatterns.com, they refer to their patterns as a perler bead pattern. Those can be converted and used in beadwork as straight stitches. And if you find a peyote pattern, they will even have the numbers of the delica beads that they use, which is fantastic. This site is huge. There are just thousands of patterns of any possible character and cutesy thing and subject and theme that you could ever want. You can spend a lot of time there. And what's cool about this site is that these rows are numbered, which is absolutely fantastic. And they're listed in the order as you thread them on. For instance, you know, generally when you start off a peyote, you put on basically 2 rows at the same time. Well, here, these are marked as row 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. That's really nice and easy, but a lot of patterns do not have this. They just have either the symbol for the color that they've used, or just the color and their blanks. So just to keep that in mind, if your pattern is just a rectangle and it's the same side, each side, it's just even, you can basically start wherever you want. However, if it's like that, I would just start from the bottom and thread on, decide what direction you're going to start off, and go adding on your first 2 rows, no matter what the pattern says. But I'm just really thrilled by this website, so I'll leave links to that one down below if you want to explore and waste a lot of your time as well, because you can get lost quickly. So then after you've threaded your 2, you turn around and you add number 2, go through 1, number 2, go through 1, number 2, go through 1, all the way down, and keep going back and forth. But I've also generally found that the patterns that are the giant, huge tapestries that are basically like cross-stitch patterns, they don't really give you a lot of tutorial on how to do the stitch. They're just like, here's a bunch of patterns, here's a picture, here is what the colors are. They don't really show you where the rows are. They expect so the best plan of action for that one is to print it off, photocopy it, and then just mark everywhere you're at in order to make sure you figure out where you're at. Now, being a nice square makes life easier, so you don't really have to pay attention to where you need to start, where your threads are going. These kind of change when you have uneven pieces, like so, or even much more complicated pieces, like so, and they have these little tendrily bits that stick out and jut everywhere. This one requires a lot more reducing and increasing. These ones are very difficult for me to do, personally, because I'm not very well practiced in peyote as well. The best advice that I can offer is start where the pattern is widest, without any extraneous pieces. Like, for example, this is going to be a blank spot. So this is, even though this is the quote-unquote widest part, this blank spot makes the length of this row here instead of here. So this would be the row that I start at instead. So I create that row. Another thing to keep in mind is this can either be a peyote pattern if the orientation is like this, or a brick stitch pattern if the orientation is like this. So the brick stitch will go in between beads. This is where you weave through and in. But if you're doing that, you'll also have to pay attention to where you're increasing and decreasing. The thing you will want to do is basically take the widest part and work from there. That way you can increase and decrease in a lot of in both directions. So here, this might even be a hole, but me, personally, I would just put white beads or clear beads there, just because I'm not about that life. But if you wanted to do a hole, I would start by working on this section, then increase these kinds of fiddly sections, and work the other pattern. Or even cut off this part completely, do this section here, and then, like, zip it together, like you would if you're making a beaded bead. So basically, when you're making these kind of cutesy patterns with a lot of finicky details, you kind of have to figure out where you want to do things and how it works. But ultimately, Here's the rules that I go by. It doesn't really matter how you do it, just as long as the result looks the same. So if you're doing weird turnarounds in places, who cares? If it looks fine in the end, it looks fine. There isn't a really cut and dry way of doing this. There probably is, but I have yet to find it. And that's just me, because I'm kind of lazy and I like to get to my results as soon as possible. But yes. So general rule, find out where the widest section is in Peyote, and do those 2 rows, and then build up from there, and do your turnarounds. When you get up to the more finicky places, you'll have to increase here, you can work here, but you'll have to decrease and decrease here, then increase twice, and you go up and up from there. Now, even count peyote is a lot easier to work with than odd count peyote, but just be prepared to do either stitch for that. So on a much more simpler design like this, I would probably start with these 2 rows here, because this row is just comprised of these 2 beads, so I'd start off with these 2 rows, and do that all the way to the end. Then with my tail end, I would add this bead in the next row, move all the way down to add this bead, and then build the rest of the way up. I'll have to increase here for a few rows, and then move up and decrease all the way to the point. But this one is a lot more simpler than this piece. So that's when it comes to peyote patterns. So you can tell by the orientation of the beads and the edges if the pattern is kind of going this direction. You've got peyote, but if you just turn it around, you can also do brick stitch if you are more comfortable with that. I would only do that with square patterns, because in this direction here, there's a lot of ends that you'll have to increase and decrease. And it's just kind of, I don't know. I would do peyote, but some people like brick better. But on the subject of perler bead patterns, you can use them in a square stitch. And however, this one you're gonna have to definitely do more work in terms of converting and finagling around places with a lot of jagged ends. Again, this is one of those instances where it doesn't really matter how you do it, just get the result the same. This pattern is pretty simple. I would start off in the center in this direction here, because this is the widest area, and you'd only have a few decreases going up from the place, and it kind of just gradually decreases. The problem turns up when you have a lot of jetting, jagged out pieces. Now, this graph is filled, so you can essentially turn this into a square. Since the way you do perler beads, you put them on the little grid things, you poke at individual things until you fill the pattern out, you iron it out, and you're done. Everything's a solid block, and nothing needs to support itself on there. Like all of these jagged pieces here, all of her whiskers would be problem points here, because there's nowhere to go off of on the rows above and below. So you're going to have to do something probably like fringe to do these little extraneous pieces, or turn the whole thing into a square. But this one's kind of interesting to start off with, because I would start off, the widest piece is here, so I would go down from here, work on, and then I would just, since these are supposed to be whiskers, just add that like fringe. And down below, we have some increasing and decreasing going on. That is kind of how I go about looking at patterns and deciphering grids and such. If you'd like me to do a video on resources for patterns and where to go to like make your own, things I use, stuff like that, let me know in the comments down below. Also check out the rest of my beginners and basics, because I have a lot of videos there that cover the stitches that I mentioned in this project. And if you don't see it, be sure to keep subscribed, because I'm working on it continuously. If there's a stitch that is a very, very high priority you want me to work on, like drop everything and work on it, let me know in the comments down below, so that I can make that happen for you. And I think that will do it for me. I hope this was helpful for you guys. Be sure to like up and subscribe if you want to see more bullshit from me, if you like this pattern. If you have specific questions on reading patterns, I had requests to do it, so I'm very self-taught and I'm a very visually oriented person, so it's kind of hard for me to encompass multiple learning styles. So if there's something specific you want me to cover, let me know in the description below. And everything As I mentioned, all pertinent links are going to be down below. If you have more questions, also be sure to come and join us on our Facebook group at Creations from Lessons with Odin. I go over a lot of materials, and there's a big community who are very happy to answer questions. So just, if you have something specific, put it out there, and everybody will comment and add their advice to it. So, be sure to check out my other shenanigans here on YouTube. Check out my SciFi if you're into that. Check out all of my other silly antics that I do to humiliate myself on the internet. All pertinent links are down below. Thank you guys so much for joining me, and of course, if there's anything I need to be trying out right now, feel free to let me know down below. And I will see you next time.